Broke single dad found a woman crying at his son's grave, and the moment she whispered why she was there, the man who thought he'd lost everything discovered a truth so shocking it threatened to destroy the only piece of family he had left. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Danny's heart thundered in his chest as he stared at the elegant woman kneeling before his son's grave. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her expensive cream-colored dress stood out against the cemetery's weathered headstones. Her words echoed in his mind, "Grandson." "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Danny's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. His hands tightened around the small chocolate cake he'd brought, its blue frosting spelling out, "Happy birthday, Caleb," in wobbly letters. The woman turned to face him, dabbing at her tears with an embroidered handkerchief. Her eyes were the same shade of warm brown as Caleb's had been. "I've been searching for so long," she said, her voice trembling. "When I saw his picture in the local paper's memorial section," she pressed the handkerchief to her mouth, struggling to compose herself. Danny felt rooted to the spot, his work boots suddenly heavy as concrete. The toy truck in his jacket pocket seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake. Caleb was my son. Please," she said, slowly rising to her feet. "My name is Margaret Wheeler. My daughter Sarah. She had a baby 16 years ago." Her eyes searched Danny's face. "She never told us who the father was, and then Margaret's voice cracked. "We lost her to an overdose when the baby was just 3 months old. By the time we learned about the child, he had already been adopted. We've been looking ever since." The world tilted beneath Danny's feet. Sarah Wheeler. He remembered the name from Caleb's adoption paperwork, a ghost from the past he'd never expected to meet. His throat felt dry as sandpaper. "The timing matches," Margaret continued softly. "And when I saw his picture, he looked so much like my Sarah did at that age." Danny carefully set the cake down beside Caleb's headstone, needing both hands free to steady himself. The morning sun felt too bright, too harsh. "I adopted Caleb when he was 4 months old," he said, each word careful and measured. His birth mother had signed away her rights. Everything was legal. "Oh, I'm not here to cause trouble," Margaret said quickly, reaching out as if to touch his arm but stopping short. I needed to know, to see where he rests, to pay my respects." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Was he happy? The question hit Danny like a physical blow. Memories flooded his mind. Caleb's first steps across their small living room, his gap-toothed grin on his first day of school, the way he'd laugh when Danny pushed him on the playground swings. Yes, Danny managed, his own eyes burning. He was the happiest kid you'd ever meet. Never met a stranger. Could make friends with anyone. He pulled the toy truck from his pocket, its red paint gleaming. He loved vehicles of all kinds. Used to come to the garage with me on Saturdays, just to watch me work on cars. Margaret smiled through her tears. Sarah was like that too, never shy, always making friends. She paused, wringing her handkerchief. Would you tell me more about him, please?" Danny looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same grief he carried reflected in her eyes. Different, but just as deep. He glanced at his watch. He had taken the whole day off work for this. "There's a diner just down the road," he said slowly. "They make decent coffee, if you'd like." "I would like that very much," Margaret replied softly. Danny bent down and picked up the cake. "Would you like to help me sing happy birthday to him first? It's tradition." Margaret's hand flew to her heart. Yes, please." Together they sang, their voices carrying across the quiet cemetery. His rough and low, hers trembling but clear. Danny lit the 16 candles he'd brought, and they watched the flames flutter in the morning breeze. "Make a wish, buddy," Danny whispered, just as he did every year. Then he blew out the candles, pretending not to notice as Margaret wiped fresh tears from her eyes. As they walked toward their cars, Margaret stopped suddenly. "Mr. Cole? Danny, please, Danny." She took a deep breath. "Thank you for loving him, for giving him the life we couldn't." Danny felt his chest tighten. "He was easy to love," he said simply, "and he's the one who gave my life meaning. I'm the lucky one." They reached the parking lot, where Margaret's sleek silver Mercedes sat next to Danny's weathered pickup truck. The contrast might have been amusing under different circumstances. "I'll follow you to the diner?" Margaret asked, her voice uncertain, as if afraid he might change his mind. Danny nodded. "It's just past the town square. Can't miss it." He paused, then added, I have photo albums at home, if you'd like to see them sometime. Margaret's eyes lit up even as they filled with tears again. I would love that more than I can say. As Danny climbed into his truck, his hands were shaking slightly. He looked in his rearview mirror at Caleb's grave, now decorated with the cake and truck, and thought about how life had a way of surprising you just when you thought you had it all figured out. He hadn't known what to expect when he'd driven to the cemetery that morning, but somehow he felt that Caleb would have loved this, would have been thrilled to pieces to discover he had a grandmother who had been searching for him all these years. And maybe, just maybe, sharing memories of Caleb with someone who loved him too might help ease the weight of grief they both carried. Danny started his truck and pulled out of the cemetery, watching in his mirror as Margaret's. Mercedes fell into line behind him. They had 16 years of stories to share, and today seemed like as good a day as any to begin. Before Danny could answer her question about Caleb's happiness, the woman straightened her shoulders and shook her head. I'm sorry, she said, dabbing at her eyes again. I haven't been entirely honest. My name is Mariah Bennett, not Margaret Wheeler. I'm from Atlanta, where I taught high school English for 30 years before retiring. Her fingers twisted the handkerchief. And I'm here because of my son David. Danny shifted his weight, confused by the sudden change. The morning dew had soaked through his work boots, making his socks damp and uncomfortable. I don't understand. What does your son have to do with Caleb? Mariah's face softened with grief. David passed away 3 months ago. Cancer. She took a deep breath, her composure wavering. Before he died, he told me something that's been haunting me ever since. A confession about a young woman named Lena. The name hit Danny like a punch to the gut. His late wife, Lena, he hadn't spoken her name aloud in months, though he thought of her every day. I don't know what you're talking about, Danny said, his voice rough. He took a step back, wanting distance from this stranger and the memories she was stirring up. Please, Mariah said, reaching into her leather handbag. I know this is difficult, but I need to show you something. Her hands trembled as she pulled out an old photograph, its corners worn and yellowed with age. This was taken almost 17 years ago. Danny didn't want to look, but his eyes were drawn to the image anyway. It showed a young couple at what looked like a county fair, cotton candy and carnival rides visible in the background. The young man was tall and handsome, with wavy dark hair and an easy smile. But it was the woman beside him that made Danny's heart stop. Lena, her honey blonde hair shorter than he'd known it, her face younger and more carefree, but unmistakably Lena. She was wearing a flowered sundress that showed the gentle curve of a pregnant belly. That's my son David with Lena, Mariah said softly. They dated for almost a year when David was in his first year of law school, when Lena got pregnant. She paused, shame crossing her features. I'm not proud of what happened next. Our family had certain expectations, certain plans for David's future. Her voice cracked. I pressured him to end things with Lena, to focus on his studies, his career. Danny stared at the photo, his mind racing. The timeline would fit. Lena had never talked much about Caleb's biological father, only saying he wasn't in the picture. She and Danny had met when Caleb was 3, fallen in love, and married a year later. Danny had adopted Caleb officially, and that was that. Or so he'd thought. David never forgave himself, Mariah continued, her words coming faster now. On his deathbed, he told me everything. How he'd loved Lena but hadn't been strong enough to stand up to family pressure. How he'd walked away when she needed him most. She wiped fresh tears from her cheeks. He made me promise to find them, to tell them how sorry he was. It took months of searching, but when I saw Caleb's picture in the paper, those eyes, they're exactly like David's. Danny's hands clenched into fists. The toy truck in his pocket dug into his hip, a sharp reminder of why he was here today. This was supposed to be a private moment between him and his son, not this. Mr. Cole, Mariah said, taking a tentative step forward. I know this is overwhelming, but please, I need to know about my grandson, about the kind of boy he was. Stop. Danny's voice came out harder than he'd intended. Just stop. Caleb was my son, mine and Lena's. Whatever happened before doesn't change that. Of course not, Mariah said quickly. I would never suggest you don't get to come here, Danny interrupted, his chest tight with anger and grief. You don't get to show up on his birthday with old photos and sad stories. Where were you 16 years ago? Where was your son when Lena was alone and pregnant? Where were you when Caleb was learning to walk? Or starting school? Or his voice broke? Or when we lost him?" Mariah flinched as if he'd struck her. "You're right," she whispered. "We have no right, but David's last wish. I need to go." Danny snatched up the cake from beside the headstone, no longer able to bear this conversation. The chocolate was starting to melt in the morning sun, the blue frosting running. "Please, just leave us alone." He turned and walked away quickly, his boots squeaking on the wet grass. Behind him, he heard Mariah call out something else, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. In his truck, Danny sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing. The cake sat beside him on the passenger seat, its cheerful message now blurred and illegible. The toy truck pressed against his leg, forgotten. His mind kept returning to the photograph. Lena, young and pregnant, smiling up at that handsome stranger. David Bennett, a man who'd abandoned her, who'd let his family's expectations matter more than his own child. A man who'd waited until his dying breath to try to make things right. Danny started the engine, the familiar rumble doing nothing to quiet the questions spinning in his head. Questions about the past, about choices made long ago, about the woman he'd loved and lost, and about the boy who'd made them a family, however briefly they'd had him. Danny's old pickup truck groaned as he pulled into his driveway. The modest white house, with its peeling paint and crooked mailbox, had never felt quite so empty. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Inside, the house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. Danny's work boots left muddy prints on the worn linoleum as he made his way to the living room. He sank into his favorite armchair, the leather cracking slightly under his weight. The photo album sat on the coffee table where he'd left it this morning. Danny reached for it with trembling hands, his fingers tracing the worn edges of its cover. Inside, memories of happier times stared back at him. There was Lena, her dark hair catching the sunlight as she pushed 3-year-old Caleb on the backyard swing. Her smile was radiant, despite the shadows under her eyes from working double shifts at the diner. "You never said anything," Danny whispered to Lena's image. He flipped through more pages, watching Caleb grow older in each photograph. Baseball games, fishing trips, birthday parties, all the moments that made up their life together. In every picture, Lena looked at their son with such pure love that Danny's chest ached. He paused at a photo from Caleb's 10th birthday. The boy was grinning widely, showing off the gap where his front teeth had fallen out. Danny remembered that day clearly, how proud Caleb had been of the model airplane they'd built together. How Lena had made his favorite chocolate cake with extra frosting. "Why didn't you tell me?" Danny asked the empty room. His voice caught in his throat as he remembered countless conversations with Lena, wondering now if there had been hints he'd missed. The sound of someone knocking at the back door startled him from his thoughts. Miss Edna Franklin stood on his back porch, holding a covered casserole dish. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her kind eyes crinkled with concern when she saw his face. "You look like you could use some company and a hot meal," she said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping inside. Miss Edna had been their neighbor for as long as Danny could remember, helping watch Caleb when both he and Lena had to work. "You didn't have to do that, Danny," protested weakly. But Miss Edna was already pulling plates from the cabinet. "Nonsense. I made too much chicken pot pie anyway." She set the table with practiced efficiency. "Sit down before you fall down, Danny Cole." Danny obeyed, watching as she served generous portions of the steaming pie. The familiar smell of her cooking filled the kitchen, reminding him of countless meals shared around this table when Caleb was alive. "Something happened today," he said finally, pushing his food around his plate. "At the cemetery." Miss Edna paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Oh? A woman was there. Said her name was Mariah Bennett." Danny watched carefully, noting how Miss Edna's hand trembled slightly as she set her fork down. "She thinks. She says Caleb might have been her grandson." The kitchen grew so quiet that Danny could hear the neighbors' wind chimes through the window. Miss Edna dabbed at her mouth with a napkin, taking her time before speaking. "The Bennetts," she said, slowly, "were quite well known in these parts years ago, before they moved to Atlanta." Danny leaned forward. "Did you know them?" "I knew of them," Miss Edna replied carefully. "They had that big house on Hill Street before it was torn down. Very prominent family." She seemed to choose her next words with great care. Their son David was a few years ahead of Lena in school. Danny's heart beat faster. "Did you know they were together?" Lena and David? Miss Edna's eyes grew sad. Danny, there are some stories that aren't mine to tell. She reached across the table and patted his hand. But maybe it's time for you to look through those letters Lena left you. Danny pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. The stairs to the attic creaked under his feet as he climbed them, his mind racing. The box of Lena's letters had sat untouched in the corner since her death 5 years ago. She'd made him promise to keep them, but he'd never found the strength to read them. The attic was stuffy and dim, dust motes dancing in the beam of light from the small window. Danny's fingers brushed against cobwebs as he made his way to the far corner where the box sat. It was smaller than he remembered, tied with a faded blue ribbon that had once been bright as a summer sky. He picked up the box, surprising himself with how light it felt. All of Lena's secrets, all her unspoken words, contained in something he could hold in his hands. Danny traced the edge of the ribbon with his thumb, remembering how Lena had looked the day she'd given him the box, her face pale but peaceful in her hospital bed. "When the time is right," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll know when." Standing in the dusty attic, holding the box of letters that might change everything he thought he knew about his family, Danny finally understood what she'd meant. But still, he couldn't bring himself to untie the ribbon. Not yet. He needed time to prepare himself for whatever truths lay inside. He sat down on an old trunk, the box heavy in his lap despite its physical lightness. Through the small attic window, he could see the sun setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and a car door slammed. Life went on outside, but in the attic, time seemed to stand still as Danny stared at the box that held his wife's final words. The morning sun filtered through Miss Edna's lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across her worn kitchen table. Danny sat across from his elderly neighbor, his coffee growing cold in the chipped ceramic mug between his calloused hands. The familiar scent of cinnamon and fresh-baked muffins that usually brought him comfort did nothing to ease the knot in his stomach. "Miss Edna," Danny said quietly, studying her weathered face. "Last night, when I mentioned the name Bennett, I saw something in your eyes. What aren't you telling me?" Miss Edna's fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed her floral apron. The morning birds chirped outside her window, their cheerful songs a stark contrast to the heavy silence in the kitchen. "Oh, Danny," she sighed, her usual steady voice wavering. "I've carried this for so long, wondering if I should have said something back then." Danny leaned forward, his chair creaking beneath him. "What is it?" Miss Edna stood slowly, making her way to the kitchen window. She stared out at her small garden, where Caleb had once helped her plant tomatoes, his little hands covered in dirt and his face beaming with pride. "It was during Lena's pregnancy," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I was coming back from the grocery store one afternoon. I saw her outside the old drugstore downtown, talking to a man I didn't recognize." Danny's throat tightened. What kind of man? Well-dressed, probably in his early 30s at the time. They weren't arguing exactly, but Lena was crying. Miss Edna turned back to face Danny, her eyes glistening. When she saw me walking toward them, she quickly wiped her eyes and the man left. I asked her if everything was all right, but she just smiled that brave smile of hers and said it was nothing. Danny pushed his coffee mug away, his hand shaking slightly. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because she seemed so determined to handle it herself," Miss Edna replied, settling back into her chair with a weary sigh. "And then you came along, Danny. You loved her so completely, treated her so kindly. When you married her and adopted Caleb, she was the happiest I'd ever seen her. I thought maybe whatever happened with that man was best left in the past." The ancient wall clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Danny rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the rough stubble beneath his fingers. "I should have told you," Miss Edna said softly, reaching across the table to pat his arm. "But I was afraid of hurting what you and Lena had built together. You were such a wonderful father to Caleb, Danny. That boy adored you." "Yeah," Danny managed, his voice rough. He cleared his throat. "I need to talk to her again. Mrs. Bennett, she's staying at the Pine Grove Motel." Miss Edna nodded slowly. "Maybe it's time for all the truth to come out, honey. Secrets have a way of weighing down our hearts, even long after we think we've buried them." Danny stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "Thank you for telling me now, Miss Edna. I understand why you kept it to yourself back then." "Will you be okay?" she asked, concern etched in the lines around her eyes. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I need to know the whole story. For Caleb's sake. For Lena's." The drive to the Pine Grove Motel felt both too long and too short. Danny's thoughts churned like an engine with bad timing, pieces of the past clicking into new positions. The photo Mariah had shown him, the man Miss Edna had seen, the sadness that sometimes crept into Lena's eyes when she thought no one was watching. The motel was a single-story building with faded blue doors and window boxes filled with artificial flowers. Danny parked his truck and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. Finally, he walked to room 112 and knocked. Mariah Bennett opened the door, already dressed impeccably despite the early hour. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her clothes crisp and expensive-looking, but her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Mr. Cole," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "There's a diner about a mile down the road," Danny said, his voice steadier than he felt. "They make decent coffee. Would you like to talk?" Relief washed over Mariah's face. "Yes, I would like that very much. Let me get my purse." They drove separately to the Sunrise Diner, an old-fashioned place with chrome trim and red vinyl booths. The morning rush had ended, leaving only a few retired regulars nursing their coffee at the counter. The waitress, a teenager with bright purple hair, led them to a booth by the window. "2 coffees," Danny ordered, and the girl nodded, leaving them alone with their heavy silence. Mariah smoothed her napkin in her lap, a nervous gesture that reminded Danny painfully of Lena. "Thank you for reaching out, Mr. Cole. I wasn't sure you would." "Danny," he corrected quietly. "Please, call me Danny." The waitress returned with their coffee. Danny watched as Mariah added a precise amount of cream to hers, her movements careful and controlled. "I learned something this morning," Danny said, wrapping his hands around his mug. "About Lena and a man she met with while she was pregnant, a well-dressed man who made her cry." Mariah's hand trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "That would have been David," she said softly. "My son." Danny nodded, feeling his heart constrict. "I think I need to hear everything now, Mrs. Bennett. No more pieces of the puzzle, the whole story. Please," she said, "call me Mariah." She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "You're right. It's time for the whole truth. But I want you to know something first, Danny. Whatever we discover in this conversation, it doesn't change what you were to Caleb, what you meant to him." Danny swallowed hard, fighting back the burning in his eyes. "Okay," he said, "tell me about your son and my wife." The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across their booth as they sat there, 2 strangers connected by love and loss, about to unravel a story that had waited years to be told. The Bell's Corner Diner hadn't changed in 20 years. The same red vinyl booths lined the windows, their edges worn smooth from countless customers sliding in and out. The metallic jingle of the bell above the door announced Danny and Mariah's arrival, drawing a few curious glances from the regular morning crowd. Danny led Mariah to a booth near the back, away from prying eyes. The contrast between them was stark, his work shirt still carrying traces of motor oil, her pearl necklace catching the fluorescent light. A tired waitress named Ruby, who'd known Danny since he was a teenager, approached with a pot of coffee. "The usual, Danny?" Ruby asked, already pouring him a cup. "Thanks, Ruby." Danny managed a small smile. "Mrs. Bennett? Just coffee, please, black." Mariah's voice was quiet but precise, her fingers nervously adjusting the napkin in front of her. They sat in uncomfortable silence until Ruby walked away. The clink of cups and murmured conversations from other tables filled the void between them. Danny wrapped his hands around the warm mug, his wedding ring catching the light. A simple gold band that had never left his finger. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Mariah finally said, her practiced composure wavering slightly. "I know this must be difficult." Danny nodded but didn't speak. The whirlwind of emotions from the past day, anger, confusion, hurt, had left him drained. "I suppose I should start at the beginning," Mariah continued, taking a careful sip of her coffee. David met Lena during his first year teaching at the community college. He was giving extra help in the writing lab. Danny's jaw tightened at hearing Lena's name from this stranger's lips, but he forced himself to listen. When David told us about her, about their relationship, Mariah's voice trailed off, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around her cup. I didn't handle it well." "What does that mean exactly?" Danny's voice was low, controlled. Mariah closed her eyes briefly, shame crossing her features. The Bennetts have been in Atlanta society for generations. David was supposed to follow a certain path when he brought Lena home. She paused, swallowing hard. I saw only what I wanted to see, a young woman from the wrong side of town, no college degree, working as a waitress. Danny's knuckles went white around his coffee cup. Lena was worth 10 of anyone I've ever known. Yes, Mariah whispered. I know that now, but then... She reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph, different from the one she'd shown at the cemetery. This one showed a younger version of herself, standing stiffly beside David and Lena at what appeared to be a dinner party. The tension in the image was palpable. I made their lives miserable, Mariah admitted, her voice cracking. Every dinner, every family gathering, I found ways to remind Lena she didn't belong, that she wasn't good enough for my son. The coffee in Danny's stomach turned to acid, but they stayed together until I discovered Lena was pregnant. Mariah's hands trembled as she returned the photo to her purse. I did something unforgivable. Danny felt a chill run through him, despite the warm diner air. What did you do? I went to see Lena alone, told her. Mariah's voice caught, told her if she didn't leave David, I would make sure he died. Lost everything. His teaching position, his inheritance, his future. I knew David would choose her over all of it, so I made the choice for them both. Danny pushed his coffee away, bile rising in his throat. The magnitude of this woman's interference, the ripple effect it had on so many lives, on his Lena, on Caleb, made him physically ill. You had no right, he said, his voice shaking with rage. No right to play God with their lives. I know, Mariah whispered, tears spilling onto her cheeks. David never knew what I'd done. He thought Lena had simply left him. It wasn't until the cancer, when he was dying, that he told me about the baby. He'd seen her once, months after she left. She was showing by then, but she wouldn't speak to him. Danny remembered how Lena would sometimes cry at night when she thought he was sleeping, especially during her pregnancy. He'd always assumed it was hormones or worry about being a single mother. Now, knowing the truth, please. Mariah reached across the table, trying to touch his hand. Danny jerked away as if burned. I know I don't deserve it, but please, let me know, my grandson, even if only through your memories. David's gone, Lena's gone, but Caleb, he was part of them both, part of a love I was too blind to see. Danny stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Several diners turned to look, but he didn't care. Caleb was my son, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I was there for every skinned knee, every school play, every baseball game. I held him when he was sick and taught him to ride a bike. I was there when he took his last breath in that hospital room. Where were you? Danny, please. Mariah started to rise. No, Danny pulled out his wallet and threw some bills on the table. You didn't want them in your life 20 years ago. You don't get to change your mind now that they're gone. He turned and walked out of the diner, ignoring Mariah's pleading. Voice behind him, the morning sun was harsh in his eyes as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Or maybe it was the tears he refused to let fall. His hands shook as he fumbled with his truck keys, the weight of this new reality pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. Behind him, he could hear Mariah's heels clicking on the pavement. Danny, wait, please. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but Caleb, he deserves to be known, to be remembered by all who loved him, even those who never got the chance to meet him. Danny paused with his hand on the truck door, but he didn't turn around. He couldn't bear to look at her face, to see David's features there, features he might now recognize in old photos of his son. I'll be at the motel for another week, Mariah said softly. If you change your mind, if you could find it in your heart to share just a little bit of him with me, I'll be there. Without a word, Danny climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving Mariah Bennett standing alone on the sidewalk, her perfectly composed facade crumbling as she watched him disappear around the corner. The morning sun beat down on Danny's neck as he bent over the engine of Mrs. Peterson's old Buick. His wrench slipped for the third time, and he muttered under his breath. The conversation with Mariah from yesterday kept playing in his mind like a broken record. Hey, Cole. Jim, his boss, called from across the garage. You've been working on that same bolt for 15 minutes. Everything okay? Danny straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Yeah, sorry, just distracted today. Take 5 if you need it, Jim offered, his weathered face showing concern. "You're no good to me if you're not focused. Might end up breaking something expensive." Danny nodded, dropping his wrench into the toolbox with a clang that echoed through the garage. He walked to the break room, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. The small room was empty, its ancient coffee maker gurgling in the corner. He slumped into a metal folding chair and stared at his grease-stained hands. "You're acting just like your daddy today," came a familiar voice. It was Ray, the oldest mechanic in the shop, standing in the doorway, all wound up tight like a spring about to snap. "I'm nothing like him," Danny shot back, immediately regretting his sharp tone. "Sorry, Ray, just got a lot on my mind." Ray just nodded and grabbed his lunch from the mini-fridge. "We all got our demons, son. Just don't let them drive the wrench." The rest of Danny's shift crawled by. He managed to finish Mrs. Peterson's Buick, but everything took twice as long as usual. By closing time, his patience had worn paper thin. When Tommy, the new apprentice, dropped a wrench on the hood of a customer's car, Danny snapped at him harder than the scratch warranted. The drive home felt longer than usual. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road, and Danny's thoughts drifted to the box in his attic, Lena's box, the one he'd been avoiding for 3 years. His small house looked tired in the fading light, its white paint peeling at the corners. Danny parked his truck and sat there for a moment, gathering his courage. Inside, the silence felt heavy, broken only by the tick of the kitchen clock Lena had loved so much. He climbed the pull-down ladder to the attic, ducking under the low ceiling. Dust motes danced in the beam of light from the small window. The box sat exactly where he'd left it, pushed against the wall under Caleb's old baby clothes. Danny's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cardboard box. It wasn't heavy, just filled with papers, photos, and memories. He carried it downstairs to the kitchen table, where the light was better. Inside, carefully bundled letters filled most of the space. Some were tied with faded ribbons, others loose. But one envelope caught his eye immediately. Unlike the others, it was sealed and marked in Lena's flowing handwriting, "For when he's ready." Danny picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The paper felt delicate, like it might crumble if he wasn't careful. His throat tightened as he traced Lena's handwriting with his finger. A knock at the door made him jump. He quickly put the letter down and went to answer it. Miss Edna stood on his porch, holding one of her famous peach pies. The sweet aroma wafted through the screen door. "Thought you might need this today?" she said, her kind eyes taking in his troubled expression. "You didn't have to do that," Danny said, but he opened the door to let her in. "Nonsense. When have I ever needed a reason to bring pie?" She bustled into his kitchen, clucking her tongue at the empty coffee pot. "Let me fix us some coffee to go with this." Danny watched as she moved around his kitchen with familiar ease, filling the pot and pulling plates from the cabinet. She'd done this countless times when Caleb was alive, bringing over treats and helping with homework while Danny worked late. "I see you got the box down," she observed quietly, nodding toward the table. Danny sank into a chair. "Found a letter I never knew about, from Lena." Miss Edna set 2 steaming mugs on the table and cut generous slices of pie. "And have you read it?" "No." Danny pushed the envelope across the table. "Not sure I want to." Miss Edna studied the envelope, then pushed it back toward him. "Danny Cole, that woman loved you more than life itself. Whatever's in that letter, she meant for you to have it." "What if?" Danny's voice cracked. "What if it changes everything I thought I knew?" "Honey, nothing can change what you and Lena had. Nothing can change what you were to Caleb." Miss Edna reached across the table and patted his hand. "But that Mariah Bennett. Maybe she deserves a chance to tell her side of the story." Danny took a bite of pie to avoid responding. The sweet peaches reminded him of summer afternoons with Caleb, juice dripping down their chins as they ate Miss Edna's pies on the porch. "I know you're angry with her," Miss Edna continued. "Lord knows I would be too. But that woman lost her son too, Danny. And now she's found out she had a grandson she never knew. A grandson she'll never get to meet." Danny set his fork down. "She's the reason Lena kept secrets. The reason she was alone when she found out she was pregnant." "Maybe so," Miss Edna agreed. "But people can change, Danny. You've seen it yourself, working with those boys at the garage. Sometimes people just need a second chance to do right." The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the silence that followed. Through the window, Danny could see the first fireflies of evening appearing in his backyard. Caleb used to chase them, his laughter echoing across the lawn. Finally, Danny nodded slowly. "One more meeting, that's all I'm promising." Miss Edna smiled, satisfaction evident in her eyes. That's all anyone can ask for. She stood up, gathering her purse. Now, you finished that pie. Lord knows you're too skinny these days. After she left, Danny sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking at the sealed envelope. He wasn't ready to read it yet, but for the first time since finding it, he felt like someday he might be. He carefully placed the letter back in the box with the others, but left it on the kitchen counter instead of returning it to the attic. Some doors, once open, couldn't be closed again. But maybe, he thought, that wasn't always a bad thing. The late afternoon sun painted the lake in shades of amber and gold. Danny's old pickup truck bounced along the dirt road, leading to Caleb's favorite fishing spot, with Mariah holding tight to the door handle in the passenger seat. The familiar path brought a flood of memories. Summer evenings spent teaching Caleb to cast a line, weekend picnics where the boy would name every fish he caught, even the imaginary ones. Danny pulled up near the weathered wooden dock and cut the engine. "Watch your step," he said quietly, helping Mariah out of the truck. "The boards can be slippery." They made their way down to the dock where two simple folding chairs waited in the truck bed. Danny set them up facing the water, where dragonflies skimmed the surface and cattails swayed in the gentle breeze. The scene was peaceful, almost too peaceful for the weight of the conversation ahead. This was his favorite place, Danny said, settling into his chair. He'd begged to come here every weekend, rain or shine. Said the fish were hungrier when it rained. A small smile crossed his face at the memory. Mariah sat carefully in her chair, her designer clothes looking out of place against the rustic setting. Did he catch many? More than you'd expect? Danny chuckled softly. He had this special wiggle he'd do with his line, swore it was the secret to getting the big ones. Thing is, it actually works sometimes. Just like David, Mariah whispered. He used to fish with his boss, father, had all sorts of theories about what made the fish bite. They sat in silence for a moment, watching a great blue heron glide across the water. Caleb, Danny's voice caught slightly. He had this habit of naming every fish before he threw it back. Said it wasn't fair to catch them without learning their names first. He shook his head. Used to drive me crazy, but now? He trailed off, lost in thought. Mariah dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. David was like that as a boy, so gentle. He'd rescue injured birds, nurse them back to health in shoeboxes. His father thought it was silly, but she took a shaky breath. Life has a way of hardening people, doesn't it? Danny nodded, remembering the countless times Caleb had brought home stray animals, pleading to keep them. Caleb never lost that softness, though. Even when he was sick, he worried more about how everyone else was feeling. "Tell me more," Mariah urged quietly. "Please." Danny picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hands. He had this laugh that could fill a room, and he always stood up for the underdogs at school. There was this kid, Tommy, who got picked on something awful. Caleb would sit with him at lunch every day, share his dessert, make sure nobody bothered him. Tears rolled freely down Mariah's cheeks now. David was the same way in school, always looking out for others. Before. She twisted her handkerchief in her hands. Before I taught him that some people weren't worth knowing. The words hung heavy in the air. A fish jumped nearby, creating ripples that spread across the still water. "Danny," Mariah's voice was barely above a whisper. "There's something else you need to know." She turned to face him, her eyes full of pain and regret. "When David told me about Lena's pregnancy, I didn't just disapprove. I took action." Danny's hand stilled on the stone he was holding. "I went to see Lena myself," Mariah continued, each word seeming to cost her deeply. "I told her that if she didn't leave town, didn't leave David alone, I would make sure he lost everything, his inheritance, his college fund, his future. I told her she would ruin his life." The stone slipped from Danny's fingers, landing with a soft thud on the dock. The peaceful setting suddenly felt suffocating. "I gave her money to go away." Mariah's voice cracked. "I thought I was protecting my family's reputation, our standing in the community. I was so wrong, so terribly wrong." Danny stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden planks. The same dock where he'd taught Caleb to tie fishing knots, where they'd shared countless summer days, now felt tainted by this revelation. "You," he started, but couldn't find the words. The magnitude of what she'd done, not just to David and Lena, but to Caleb, who never got to know his biological father, was overwhelming. Without another word, Danny turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the creaking boards of the dock. Behind him, he could hear Mariah's muffled sobs, but he couldn't bring himself to look back. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water, and somewhere in the distance, a loon called out across the darkening lake. The garage echoed with the metallic clang of tools against metal as Danny worked beneath a rusty Ford pickup. Sweat dripped from his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he kept going. The physical strain helped quiet his mind. Every bolt he tightened, every part he replaced, pushed thoughts of Mariah Bennett and her revelations further away. "Danny, you've been at it for 12 hours straight." Joe, his boss, called from across the garage. "Take a break, would you?" Danny slid out from under the truck, his work shirt stained with grease. "Almost done here. That's what you said 3 hours ago." Joe crossed his arms, his weathered face creased with concern. "You've been working like this for days now. Whatever's eating at you, working yourself to death, won't fix it." Danny wiped his hands on a rag, avoiding Joe's knowing look. His phone buzzed in his pocket, another message from Mariah. Like the others, he left it unread. "I'm fine," Danny muttered, reaching for his wrench again. "Go home, son," Joe said firmly. "That's not a suggestion." Back home, Danny stood in his kitchen, staring at the pile of mail on the counter. Bills, advertisements, and beneath them all, the envelope he'd found in Lena's box of letters. "For when he's ready," written in her familiar flowing script. He'd carried it with him for days, unable to open it, unable to leave it behind. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a brief message. "I'm heading back to Atlanta. I'm sorry for everything." Mariah Danny sank into a kitchen chair, the envelope heavy in his hands. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but Lena's handwriting remained clear and strong. With trembling fingers, he finally broke the seal. "My dearest Danny, if you're reading this, then you know about David. Maybe you've figured it out on your own, or maybe life has found some other way to bring the truth to light. Either way, I owe you the whole story. I met David Bennett when I was young and foolish, working at that little diner off Route 9. He was different from anyone I'd ever known. Educated, from a wealthy family, full of dreams about changing the world. We fell in love, or what we thought was love. When I got pregnant, everything changed. His mother, Mariah, came to see me one day. She made it clear that someone like me would never be welcome in their family. She said David had a bright future ahead of him, and I would only hold him back. Maybe she was right about that part. But when she offered me money to disappear, I refused. I had my pride, even then. David chose his family's expectations over us. It hurt, Danny. It hurt so much I thought I'd never breathe right again. But then I met you." Danny paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He could almost hear Lena's voice, soft and clear, as if she were sitting right beside him. "You never asked about Caleb's father, not once. You just loved him, completely and without question. From the very first moment, you became his daddy in all the ways that truly matter. I watched you teach him to ride a bike, kiss his scraped knees, check under his bed for monsters. I saw how your face lit up every time he called you Dad. I didn't tell you the truth because it didn't matter. DNA doesn't make a father. Love does. And you, Danny Cole, loved our son with everything you had. If you're reading this, I imagine you're feeling betrayed, maybe even questioning everything we had together. Please don't. What we had was real. What you and Caleb had was real. Nothing can change that. I forgive David for his weakness, and I forgive Mariah for her prejudice. Life is too short to carry anger, and love is too precious to waste on bitterness. I hope you can forgive me for keeping this secret. I hope you can forgive yourself for whatever guilt you're carrying right now, because I know you, Danny Cole, and I know you're probably finding some way to blame yourself. Remember how you loved him. Remember how he loved you. That's what matters. That's what's real. All my love, Lena." The letter fell from Danny's shaking hands. He buried his face in his palms, and for the first time since Caleb's death, he let himself cry, deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beneath his bones. He cried for Lena's silent burden, for Caleb's unknown heritage, for his own fears and doubts. Through the window, the setting sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor, the same kitchen where he'd helped Caleb with homework, where they'd made midnight snacks during thunderstorms, where they'd burned countless batches of cookies trying to recreate Lena's recipe. Every memory seemed sharper now, tinged with new meaning, but no less precious. Danny picked up the letter again, reading it, through tears until the words blurred together. Lena's forgiveness wrapped around him like a warm embrace. easing something tight and painful in his chest. She had known he would struggle with this, known he would need her words even years later. His phone lay silent on the table, Mariah's last message still unanswered. Danny thought about her driving back to Atlanta, carrying her own burden of regret and loss. He thought about David, making his deathbed confession, trying to make peace with his choices. He thought about Caleb, who had somehow inherited David's gentle soul without ever knowing him. The tears slowly subsided, leaving Danny exhausted but somehow lighter. He folded Lena's letter carefully, holding it against his heart for a long moment before placing it back in its envelope. The truth hadn't changed who Caleb was, or what they'd meant to each other. It hadn't changed the thousands of moments they'd shared, the love they'd built day by day. In the growing darkness of his kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of memory and the weight of revelation, Danny Cole began to understand what Lena had known all along, that love, in its purest form, transcends blood and bone, reaches beyond secrets and shame, and finds its truth in the simple act of choosing to care, day after day, through all the joys and sorrows life brings. The morning sun cast long shadows across Miss Edna's front porch as Danny settled into the old wooden rocking chair beside her. His hands trembled slightly as he held Lena's letter, the paper worn and soft from years of storage. "I can't read it alone," Danny said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Miss Edna reached over and patted his knee. "Then don't, honey. I'm right here." Danny took a deep breath and unfolded the letter. The familiar sight of Lena's neat handwriting made his heart ache. "My dearest Danny," he began reading, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you're reading this, then you know about David Bennett. I've carried this secret for so long, wondering when and how to tell you. But every time I saw the way you loved our son, because he is our son, Danny, I couldn't bring myself to change what we had." He paused, clearing his throat. Miss Edna handed him a glass of sweet tea, and he took a grateful sip before continuing. "I met David when I was young and foolish, thinking love could conquer anything, but his mother made it clear that someone like me would never be good enough for her son. When I found out I was pregnant, David was already gone, pushed away by his family's expectations. I was alone and scared until I met you." Danny's voice cracked. Miss Edna's eyes glistened with tears as she listened. "You never asked about Caleb's father, never made me feel less than worthy. You loved him from the moment you saw him, and that love never wavered. That's what makes a real father. Danny, not blood, not DNA, but the choice to love unconditionally every single day. I want you to know that I forgive everyone involved, David, his mother, myself, and I hope one day you can forgive me for not telling you sooner. All my love, Lena." The porch fell silent except for the gentle creaking of the rocking chairs and the distant sound of wind chimes. "She was right, you know," Miss Edna said softly, "about what makes a real father." Danny folded the letter carefully. "I keep thinking about Caleb, about all the questions he never got to ask, about his heritage, his history. Then maybe it's time to get some answers," Miss Edna suggested. "For both of you," Danny nodded slowly. "Mariah went back to Atlanta, and Atlanta's not that far away," Miss Edna pointed out. She reached for her purse and pulled out a piece of paper. "I did some asking around. This is her address." Danny stared at the neatly written address. "You think I should go?" "I think your pride's been doing an awful lot of talking lately," Miss Edna said firmly. "Maybe it's time to let your heart do some of the listening." The next morning, Danny found himself driving north on I-75 toward Atlanta. The familiar Georgia landscape rolled past his window, pine forests giving way to suburban sprawl, then the distant Atlanta skyline rising like a mirage in the summer heat. Mariah's house sat in an elegant neighborhood in Buckhead, its brick facade and manicured lawn speaking of old money and tradition. Danny parked his weathered pickup truck along the curb, feeling out of place in his clean but worn jeans and work boots. He walked up to the front door, his heart pounding. Before he could lose his nerve, he pressed the doorbell. Mariah opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise. She looked smaller somehow, less intimidating in casual clothes, her silver hair pulled back in a simple clip. "Danny?" she breathed. I wasn't expecting." "I read Lena's letter," he said simply. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please, come in." The house was cool and quiet, filled with antiques and family photos. Mariah led him to a sunny sitting room where large windows overlooked a garden. "Would you like some tea?" she offered, her hands fidgeting with her sleeve. "That'd be nice," Danny said, surprising himself. As she left for the kitchen, his eyes were drawn to a large photo album on the coffee table. Mariah returned with 2 glasses of iced tea, noticing his gaze. "Those are David's childhood photos," she said softly. "Would you like to see them?" Danny nodded, and she sat beside him, opening the album. The first photo showed a young boy with dark curly hair and bright eyes, holding a baseball bat. "That was David at 8, Mariah said. "He loved baseball, played all through school." Danny's breath caught. The resemblance to Caleb was striking, the same dimpled smile, the same way of standing with his head slightly tilted. "Caleb played too," he found himself saying. "Made the Little League All-Stars when he was 10. Mariah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. There was David at various ages, riding a bike, graduating elementary school, fishing with his father. Each photo revealed another echo of Caleb, another shared trait that Danny had never understood before. "He has had David's eyes," Mariah said softly. "The same shape, the same color. And his laugh," Danny added, remembering. "That big, whole-body laugh that just took over." They sat together, going through the photos, each sharing stories about the boys they'd lost. The afternoon light shifted and softened, but neither noticed the passing time. For the first time, their grief found common ground, their shared loss creating a bridge across their differences. "I was wrong," Mariah said, finally, closing the album. "So terribly wrong about everything, about Lena, about what makes a family." She looked at Danny with tears in her eyes. "And about you. You gave my grandson something David and I never could, unconditional love, without judgment or expectation." Danny felt the last prosent of his anger beginning to dissolve, replaced by a bittersweet understanding. "Lena gave me the greatest gift when she chose me to be Caleb's father," he said. "Maybe now it's time for me to honor that gift by sharing his memory with you." The late afternoon sun painted Mariah's affluent Atlanta neighborhood in warm golden hues. Danny walked beside her along the tree-lined sidewalk, his work boots a stark contrast to her polished loafers. The manicured lawns and stately homes made him feel out of place, but he pushed the discomfort aside. "Caleb loved climbing trees," Danny said, gesturing to a towering oak. "There was this one maple in our backyard drove me crazy watching him go higher and higher, but he never fell. Had the balance of a cat, that boy." Mariah smiled softly. "David was the same way as a child. I used to find him perched in the magnolia outside his bedroom window, reading comics when he should have been sleeping." They walked in silence for a moment, their footsteps echoing off the concrete. A cool breeze rustled through the leaves above them, carrying the sweet scent of someone's flowering garden. "He wanted to be a veterinarian," Danny continued, his voice growing thick. "Had this way with injured animals, always bringing home strays, birds with broken wings, limping dogs. He'd nurse them back to health in our garage." Mariah stopped walking, her eyes glistening. David wanted to be a doctor. He became an accountant, instead safer, more practical. "I wonder now if I pushed him too hard in that direction." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I did that a lot, you know. Pushed people toward what I thought was best, without considering their hearts." Danny shoved his hands in his pockets, studying the sidewalk. "Like when you pushed Lena away." "Yes," Mariah whispered. "That's my greatest shame. I was so concerned with appearances, with what people would think." She turned to face him fully. "I robbed David of knowing his son. I robbed Caleb of coming, knowing his father. And I robbed myself of years with my grandson." A dog barked in the distance, and a car door slammed somewhere down the street. Danny felt the weight of her words settle between them. "I don't know how to forgive you," he said honestly, "but I want to try, for Caleb's sake. He wouldn't want anyone carrying this much hurt." Mariah nodded, wiping at her eyes with trembling fingers. "He sounds like he was a remarkable boy." "He was," Danny's voice cracked. "Smart as a whip, but kind too, always thinking of others." When he got sick, he trailed off, the memories still too raw. They resumed walking, their pace slower now. The shadows lengthened across the pristine lawns as the sun dipped lower. "I've been thinking," Mariah said after a while. "I'd like to set up a scholarship in Caleb's name for students interested in veterinary medicine. It's not much, but it might help other children follow the dream he never got to pursue." Danny stopped walking, caught off guard by her suggestion. "You do that?" "Of course." Mariah's voice was gentle but firm. "It won't change the past, but maybe it can create something good for the future, something that honors who he was." Danny felt tears prick at his eyes. He blinked them back, overwhelmed by the gesture. He would have liked that. He was always trying to help others, even when he was sick himself. They had circled back to Mariah's house now, a beautiful colonial with white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges. The setting sun cast long shadows across its brick facade. "Would you like to come in?" Mariah asked hesitantly. "I have more photos of David I could show you." Danny shook his head. "Not tonight. I should head back to my motel. Got a long drive home tomorrow." He paused, then added, "But maybe next time." Mariah's eyes lit up at those words. "Next time," she repeated softly. "I'd like that." They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite sure how to end the evening. Finally, Mariah reached out and squeezed Danny's arm gently. "Thank you for coming, Danny, for giving me a chance to explain, even though I don't deserve it." Danny nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you for sharing David with me. It helps, knowing where Caleb came from." They said their goodbyes, and Danny walked back to his truck parked on the street. As he drove away, he watched Mariah's figure grow smaller in his rearview mirror, standing on her front steps until he turned the corner. The next morning, Danny pointed his truck south toward home. The Atlanta skyline faded behind him as he merged onto the interstate, his mind full of contradicting emotions. Grief and hope, anger and understanding, loss and possibility all swirled together like oil and water, refusing to mix cleanly. The familiar Georgia countryside rolled past his windows. Fields of cotton stretched to the horizon, punctuated by patches of pine forest. Signs for small towns he knew by heart flashed by. Exits that would take him to garages where he'd helped stranded motorists, diners where he and Caleb had shared countless meals. Every mile brought him closer to home, but something had shifted. The weight of secrets revealed and truths confronted sat heavy in his chest, yet somehow he felt lighter too. Like the first breath after a long dive underwater, painful but necessary. The youth center's worn basketball court echoed with hollow thuds as Danny's boots crossed its cracked surface. Faded lines marked the floor where Caleb had once played pickup games after school. The familiar musty smell of old equipment and floor wax brought back memories of watching his son's games from the rickety bleachers. Mr. Henry Lawson, the center's director, emerged from his tiny office with his usual warm smile, though it seemed strained today. "Danny, haven't seen you around here since." He trailed off, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Yeah, it's been a while." Danny ran his hand along the wall, noting the peeling paint and water. Stains on the ceiling. "Place hasn't changed much. That's part of the problem." Mr. Lawson sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Budget cuts keep coming. County's talking about shutting us down by year's end if we can't get funding." Danny stopped at a bulletin board covered with faded photos. His throat tightened as he spotted Caleb in one, grinning wide with a group of kids after winning a tournament. "How many kids still come here?" "About 30 regulars. More when school's out." Mr. Lawson gestured to the ancient heating unit rattling in the corner. "But with equipment breaking down and the roof leaking, we're running out of options." Danny walked over to examine the heater, his mechanic's instincts kicking in. "This thing's ancient. Parts probably aren't even made anymore. Tell me about it, and that's just one item on a very long list." Mr. Lawson pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. "New roof, electrical upgrades, fresh paint, working AC. We're looking at costs that would bankrupt us even if we had the money, which we don't." Danny studied the list, his mind racing. The center had been Caleb's second home, a safe place where he'd grown from a shy kid into a confident teenager who helped coach the younger children. The thought of it closing felt like losing another piece of his son. That evening, Danny sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. Mariah's number glowed on the screen. His thumb hovered over it as doubt crept in. But then his eyes fell on Caleb's last school photo on the wall, and he pressed dial. "Danny?" Mariah answered on the second ring, surprise evident in her voice. "Hey." He cleared his throat. "Got a minute?" "Of course." Danny explained about the youth center, his words coming faster as he described its importance to Caleb and the other kids in town. He loved that place. Spent almost every afternoon there after his mom died. Mr. Lawson. He really looked out for him. There was a pause on the other end. "How much would it take to keep it running?" Danny quoted the rough figures Mr. Lawson had shown him. The sum felt massive to him, but he heard Mariah make a thoughtful sound. "Send me the details," she said finally. "I'd like to help. Anonymously, of course. It seems like something David would have wanted too. He always had a soft spot for kids." Relief flooded through Danny. "Thank you." he managed. Really? No, thank you for letting me be part of this. 2 weeks later, Mr. Lawson called an emergency meeting at the center. His eyes were bright with tears as he announced an anonymous donor had provided enough funding for a complete renovation and operating costs for the next year. Danny hung back as the small crowd of parents and kids cheered. Mr. Lawson caught his eye and gave him a questioning look, but Danny just shrugged, keeping Mariah's secret. The transformation began quickly. Contractors arrived to repair the roof and update the electrical system. Danny started showing up. After work, tool belts slung around his waist, fixing what he could. He replaced broken door hinges, patched holes in the drywall, and spent hours coaxing the old heating system back to life. One evening, as he worked on replacing a damaged basketball hoop, he heard footsteps behind him. Mr. Lawson stood there, hands in his pockets. You know, the director said quietly, Caleb used to talk about becoming a youth coach here someday. Said this place made him feel like he belonged. Danny tightened a bolt, blinking against the sudden moisture in his eyes. Yeah, he mentioned that to me too. Whatever strings you pulled to make this happen, mister. Lawson gestured at the improvements around them. I know he'd be proud. Danny climbed down from the ladder, wiping his hands on his jeans. Through the freshly cleaned windows, he could see kids playing on the new outdoor court, their laughter carrying through the walls. I had help, he admitted, from someone who never got to meet him but wishes they had. Mr. Lawson nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to help others make new memories. Danny picked up his tools, the weight familiar in his hands. The center was slowly coming back to life, not just with new paint and repairs, but with the energy of children who needed it just as much as Caleb once had. Maybe this was part of healing too, taking the love he had for his son and turning it into something that could help others. As he worked into the evening, the sound of bouncing basketballs and children's voices filled the air, echoing off walls that no longer felt quite so empty. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the youth center's newly painted walls. Danny wiped his brow, admiring the fresh coat of bright blue that had replaced the old peeling paint. The sound of tires on gravel made him turn. A silver Mercedes pulled into the parking lot, and Mariah stepped out, looking both elegant and slightly uncertain in her cream-colored blazer. I hardly recognized the place, she called out, shielding her eyes from the sun. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached. Danny climbed down from his ladder. Yeah, amazing what a little TLC can do. He gestured to the building. New roof, fresh paint, fixed AC. The kids will have somewhere decent to hang out again. Mariah ran her hand along the wall, careful not to get paint on her sleeve. Caleb loved it here? Every day after school. Danny's voice softened. Said it was his favorite place in town, besides the lake. They walked inside, where volunteers were installing new ceiling tiles and light fixtures. The basketball court gleamed with fresh varnish, and new nets hung from the hoops. In the game room, pristine pool tables had replaced the worn-out ones. Miss Edna's been asking about you, Danny said, breaking a comfortable silence. She insisted I invite you to dinner tonight. Mariah's eyes widened slightly. Oh, I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition. She's been cooking since sunrise. He managed a small smile. And she's not someone you say no to. At 7 o'clock, they pulled up to Miss Edna's cheerful yellow house. The porch lights were on, and the smell of home cooking wafted through the screen door. Miss Edna appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. Well, don't just stand there like strangers, she called out. Come on in before the chicken gets cold. Inside, the dining room table was set with Miss Edna's best china and fresh flowers. Steam rose from a platter of fried chicken, and bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, and cornbread filled the spaces between. This is incredible, Mariah said, taking in the spread. Miss Edna waved off the compliment. Just a simple supper. Now sit, sit. They settled around the table, and Miss Edna said grace. As they began passing dishes, the initial awkwardness melted away like butter on warm bread. Remember when Caleb tried to teach himself to make biscuits? Danny asked, surprising himself with the memory. He was about 10, flour everywhere. Miss Edna chuckled. Lord, yes. Looked like a ghost had exploded in my kitchen. Did he succeed? Mariah asked eagerly. Well, Danny grinned. Depends on how you define success. They were more like hockey pucks than biscuits. Laughter filled the room, genuine and warm. Miss Edna shared stories about Caleb's attempts to help in her garden, and Danny talked about teaching him to change oil at the garage. With each story, Mariah's face lit up, drinking in every detail about the grandson she'd never known. "He sounds so much like David when he was young," Mariah said softly. "Always trying to fix things, always wanting to help." Miss Edna reached over and patted Mariah's hand. "Well, now you're helping fix things too, aren't you?" The evening stretched on, comfortable and healing. Over Miss Edna's peach cobbler, they shared more stories, filling in the gaps of Caleb's life for Mariah. For the first time, Danny felt no resentment as he watched her laugh and cry at their tales. Instead, he felt something like peace. When it was time to leave, Miss Edna hugged them both tight. "Don't be strangers now," she said firmly. "Either of you." Danny drove Mariah back to her hotel, but she insisted on stopping by his house first to pick up a folder she'd left earlier. While he searched for it in the kitchen, she lingered by the counter, her hand moving quickly. Later that night, after Mariah had gone, Danny found the check. The amount would have covered his mortgage for 6 months. His first instinct was anger. He didn't need charity. But as he held the check, he remembered her face as she'd listened to stories about Caleb, her genuine desire to help, to be part of something. Still, he couldn't accept it. He tore the check into tiny pieces, but as he did, he felt something shift inside him. The gesture itself, misguided as it was, spoke of care, of Godmen, family. It was the kind of thing a grandmother would do. Danny swept the pieces into the trash, but the warmth of the evening stayed with him. For the first time since losing Caleb, his house didn't feel quite so empty. The stories they'd shared had filled it with something new. Not replacing what was lost, but creating space for something different. Something like hope. The youth center buzzed with excitement on its grand reopening day. Colorful balloons decorated the freshly painted walls, and hand-drawn welcome signs made by local children covered the entrance. The late September breeze carried the sweet scent of Miss Edna's famous peach cobbler through the open windows. Danny stood in front of the mirror in the newly renovated bathroom, adjusting his clean work shirt, the nicest one he owned. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he smoothed down the collar. Public speaking had never been his thing. That had been Caleb's gift. The boy could talk to anyone, make friends, wherever he went. 10 minutes, Mr. Cole," Mr. Lawson called from the hallway, his voice carrying the same enthusiastic energy he'd maintained throughout the renovation process. Danny took a deep breath and stepped out. The main activity room was packed with familiar faces, parents, kids, teachers, and community members who'd supported the center over the years. Near the refreshment table, Miss Edna arranged cookies on a platter while a group of children pressed their faces against the glass of the new ping-pong table. His eyes found Mariah at the back of the room. She wore a simple blue dress and stood slightly apart from the crowd, but her presence felt right somehow. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. "Mr." Lawson stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. "Welcome everyone to the grand reopening of our beloved youth center." The crowd applauded warmly, thanks to the incredible generosity of an anonymous donor. His eyes flickered briefly to Mariah, and the hard work of our volunteers, especially Mr. Danny Cole, were able to provide an even better space for our community's children. Danny's heart thumped harder as Mr. Lawson continued. "And now, I'd like to invite Danny to say a few words about why this place means so much to him and his family." The walk to the podium felt endless. Danny gripped the edges of the wooden stand, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. His throat felt dry. Then he spotted a photo on the wall, one of many that now decorated the space. It showed Caleb at 11 teaching a younger kid how to hold a basketball properly. His face lit up with that characteristic patience and kindness. "My son Caleb," Danny began, his voice rough with emotion, "spent countless hours in this building. Some of you might remember him. He was the kid who'd always let others go first at the water fountain, who'd share his snacks without being asked, who'd stick up for the little ones when they needed help." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What some of you don't know is that Caleb wasn't my biological son. I met his mother Lena when he was just a baby, and from the moment I held him, he was mine. Not by blood, but by choice, by love." The room was completely silent now. Danny could feel Mariah's presence, though he didn't look her way. Being a father isn't about DNA. It's about showing up. It's about loving unconditionally. It's about teaching a kid to ride a bike even though you're terrified they'll fall. It's about staying up all night when they're sick, about celebrating their victories and helping them learn from their mistakes. His voice grew stronger. This center was Caleb's second home. Here, he learned to play basketball, made his best friends, and most importantly, learned to be there for others. When we lost him 2 years ago, I thought that part of my life was over. But standing here today, seeing all these kids who'll benefit from this place just like he did, I know his spirit lives on in. Every kind word, every helping hand, every moment of connection that'll happen within these walls. Danny looked up, finally meeting Mariah's tear-filled eyes. And I've learned recently that family can grow in unexpected ways, that healing can come from surprising places, and that love, the kind that makes us family, never really dies. It just finds new ways to express itself. The applause that followed was thunderous. Children rushed forward to hug Danny's legs, parents wiped away tears, and Mr. Lawson beamed with pride. Miss Edna dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, while Mariah remained in her corner, one hand pressed to her heart. The celebration continued into the evening. Kids tested out the new equipment, parents chatted over refreshments, and the sound of laughter filled every corner of the building. As the crowd thinned and the sky darkened, Danny found himself on the front porch, watching fireflies dance in the growing dusk. The door creaked open behind him, and Mariah stepped out, 2 paper cups of lemonade in her hands. She offered one to Danny and settled into the wooden chair beside him. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "What you said about family and love, you gave words to things I've spent years trying to understand." Danny took a sip of lemonade. "I meant every word." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies blink on and off like earthbound stars. A child's laugh echoed from inside the building, followed by the familiar thump of a basketball. "You know," Mariah said, "I spent so many years focused on what proper families should look like, I forgot to see what was right in front of me. David would have been proud to know his son was raised by someone like you." Danny turned to look at her, seeing not the proud woman who'd first appeared at Caleb's grave, but someone who'd learned the same hard lessons he had about love and loss. "I think," he said carefully, "Caleb would have been happy to know he had 2 families, who loved him, each in their own way." Mariah smiled, wiping away a tear. "I head back to Atlanta tomorrow morning, but I'd like to come back soon, maybe next month. The center will need ongoing support, and I'd like to hear more stories about Caleb, if you're willing to share them." Danny nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the evening air. "I'd like that. And I've got photos, boxes of them. Some you might want copies of." More fireflies rose from the grass, their gentle light mirroring the stars that were beginning to appear overhead. Inside the center, Mr. Lawson was calling the last few kids to wrap up their games. Parents' cars pulled up, and the sounds of goodbye filled the air. "Thank you," Mariah said suddenly, "for letting me be part of this, for giving me a chance to make something right." Danny watched another firefly blink past. "Thank you for helping me remember that family can grow even after loss." They sat together until the last car left the parking lot. 2 people connected by love for a boy who'd never known how many lives he'd touched, how many hearts he'd healed. The afternoon sun beat down on the empty stretch of Highway 29, making the asphalt shimmer in the heat. Danny's old blue Ford pickup sputtered and jerked, the brake pedal suddenly going soft under his foot. His heart jumped as he pumped the pedal frantically, but nothing happened. The truck was losing speed but still rolling forward. "Come on, old girl," he muttered, carefully steering toward the shoulder. The steering wheel shook in his hands as he guided the dying vehicle. Sweat beaded on his forehead, partly from the heat and partly from strain. When the truck finally came to a stop, Danny sat for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel. He reached for his phone in the cup holder and dialed the garage where he worked. "Hey Mike, truck's dead on Highway 29, about 2 miles past the Johnson Creek Bridge. Brake line's shot, I think." He listened for a pert moment. "Yeah, I can push it further off the road. Thanks." Stepping out into the heat, Danny sized up the situation. The truck wasn't completely clear of the right lane. Cars whizzed past, some honking in irritation. He needed to get it fully onto the shoulder. Danny planted his feet and pressed his shoulder against the driver's side door. The truck was heavy, but it started to move inch by inch. The muscles in his legs burned with the effort. A few more feet and it would be safe. He didn't hear the screeching tires until it was too late. The impact came from behind, throwing Danny forward. Pain exploded through his body as he hit the pavement. The world spun in a blur of sky and concrete. Someone was screaming, maybe multiple people. He tried to move but couldn't. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" A woman's voice pierced through the haze. Someone called 911. Danny tried to speak, to tell them he was okay, but no words came out. The hot pavement burned against his cheek. Darkness crept in, at the edges of his vision. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" Another voice, closer now. "Don't move. The ambulance is coming." The voices began to fade, replaced by a rushing sound in his ears. Danny thought of Caleb, of the toy truck still sitting on his grave. He thought of Mariah and their conversation on the porch just days ago. Then everything went black. The fluorescent lights of Memorial Hospital cast harsh shadows across Miss Edna's worried face as she hurried through the emergency room doors. Her normally neat gray hair was disheveled, and she'd forgotten her cardigan despite the evening chill. "Danny Cole," she said to the nurse at the front desk. Her voice trembling slightly. "They brought him in about an hour ago. Car accident on Highway 29. The nurse typed something into her computer. "Are you family?" Miss Edna hesitated. "I'm the closest thing to family he's got right now. Please." The nurse's expression softened. "He's in trauma room 3. Doctor's still with him, but I'll let you know as soon as you can see him." Miss Edna sank into one of the hard plastic chairs in the waiting room. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She'd saved Mariah's number after the youth center opening, just in case. Now she was glad she had. The phone rang 3 times before Mariah answered. "Miss Edna?" Mariah's voice was surprised, but warm. "I wasn't expecting." "It's Danny," Miss Edna cut in, her voice catching. "There's been an accident. His truck. He's unconscious at Memorial Hospital. I thought you should know." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "I'm in Atlanta, but I can be there in 3 hours. Please, keep me updated." "Of course, dear." Miss Edna's voice softened. "Drive safely." The next few hours passed in a blur of coffee cups and whispered prayers. The doctor finally emerged, looking tired but not grave. Danny had a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and various cuts and bruises, but would recover. He was still unconscious from the pain medication, but stable. Miss Edna sat with him until visiting hours ended, watching his chest rise and fall beneath the white hospital blanket. His face was pale, except for an angry purple bruise spreading across his left cheek. Various machines beeped steadily around him, their rhythm somehow both reassuring and unsettling. Just as she was preparing to leave, Mariah appeared in the doorway. Her usually immaculate appearance was slightly rumpled from the drive, and her eyes were red-rimmed with worry. "Oh," she breathed, taking in Danny's still form. "How is he?" "Stable," Miss Edna said, standing slowly. "The doctor says he'll recover fully, but it'll take time." She gathered her purse. "I need to head home, but would you stay with him? I don't want him to wake up alone." Mariah nodded, already moving to take Miss Edna's vacant chair. "Of course. I'll be here all night if they let me." After Miss Edna left, Mariah settled into the chair beside Danny's bed. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of rubber-soled shoes in the hallway. She reached out hesitantly and took Danny's hand, careful to avoid the IV line. "I'm here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Then, closing her eyes, she began to pray silently. She prayed for healing, for strength, for the chance to make things right. She prayed for the boy she'd never known and the man who'd loved him as his own. She prayed until the words ran out, and then she just sat, holding his hand in the dim light of the hospital room, waiting for morning. The night nurse came in periodically to check Danny's vitals, each time offering Mariah a sympathetic smile. Outside the window, stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, twinkling against the black velvet of night. Still, Mariah stayed, her hand warm around Danny's cold fingers, keeping her silent vigil. The first thing Danny noticed was pain. It radiated through his chest with each breath, sharp and insistent. The second thing was the steady beeping of machines somewhere to his left. He tried to open his eyes, but they felt heavy, like they were glued shut. "Danny?" A familiar voice cut through the fog. "Can you hear me?" He managed to crack his eyes open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights. Miss Edna's concerned face swam into view, followed by Mariah's. They both looked tired, with dark circles under their eyes. "What?" His voice came out as a croak. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Here," Mariah said, holding a small cup of water with a straw to his lips. Small sips. The cool water was heaven on his parched throat. As his mind cleared, fragments of memory came back. His truck breaking down, trying to push it off the road. Then pain and darkness. "How long?" he managed. "About 18 hours, Miss Edna answered, patting his hand. You gave us quite a scare, young man. Before Danny could respond, a quote, doctor in a white coat entered the room. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. Mr. Cole, good to see you awake. The doctor picked up his chart. I'm Dr. Matthews. You got 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and some impressive bruising. But considering what happened, you're lucky. The impact could have been much worse. Danny tried to sit up, but immediately regretted it as pain shot through his chest. Both women moved to stop him. Don't you dare, Miss Edna scolded. You need to stay still. I can't just lie here, Danny protested weakly. I've got work and the garage. The garage will survive without you for a few weeks, doctor, Matthews said firmly. You need complete rest to let those ribs heal. No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity. I'm recommending at least 3 weeks off work. 3 weeks? Danny's voice rose in disbelief. Doc, I can't. He'll take the full 3 weeks, Mariah cut in, her tone brooking no argument. I'll make sure of it. Danny looked between the 3 faces, staring down at him, all wearing identical expressions of stern determination. He recognized defeat when he saw it. Fine, he sighed, then winced at the pain the deep breath caused. But I can manage on my own at home. I don't need… Oh, hush, Miss Edna interrupted. Mariah's already arranged to stay at the Red Roof Inn until you're back on your feet, and I'm right next door if you need anything. Danny turned to Mariah in surprise. You don't have to do that. You've got your own life in Atlanta. My life can wait, Mariah said simply. This is more important. Something in her voice made Danny's protest die in his throat. He lay back against the pillows, suddenly exhausted. The next few days passed in a blur of pain, medication, physical therapy assessments, and visitors from the garage. By the time Danny was released, he had to admit he needed the help. Just walking from the hospital to Mariah's car left him winded and shaking. The first week, at home established a routine. Miss Edna brought breakfast every morning, fussing over him until he ate every bite. Mariah arrived mid-morning with books, magazines, or just conversation to keep him from going stir-crazy. She'd make lunch, ensure he took his medication, and often stayed through dinner, which they shared on TV trays while watching old movies. One morning, about 10 days after the accident, Mariah arrived looking more serious than usual. She carried her usual tote bag, but also held a large manila envelope. What's that? Danny asked from his spot on the couch, where he'd graduated from lying flat to sitting up with plenty of pillows. Mariah sat in the armchair across from him, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. Something I've been working on since we first met. She opened the envelope and pulled out an official-looking document. It's Caleb's birth certificate. Amended. Danny's heart seemed to skip a beat. What do you mean, amended? I hired a lawyer, Mariah explained softly. With Lena's letter as evidence and DNA records from David's medical file, we were able to petition for a correction. She held out the document. David's name has been added as his biological father. Danny's hands trembled slightly as he took the paper. There it was in black and white. Father David Alexander Bennett. The name looked strange next to Lena's, like 2 worlds that were never meant to collide, suddenly sharing the same space. I know this might be difficult, Mariah continued, when Danny remained silent. But I thought Caleb deserved to have his full history documented. For the record, if nothing else. Danny stared at the document, emotions warring in his chest. Part of him wanted to tear it up, to protect the simple truth he'd lived with for so long, that Caleb was his son, period. But another part, the part that had grown during these weeks of knowing Mariah, understood why this mattered. You're right, he said, finally, his voice rough. He deserved the truth, even if he's not here to know it. Mariah's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for understanding. And Danny, this doesn't change anything about who you were to him, who you are. Danny nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice again, it was barely above a whisper. I know, I'm still his dad. This just makes the picture complete somehow. Yes, Mariah agreed softly. Complete. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the birth certificate resting on Danny's lap. Outside, birds chirped in the morning sunshine, and somewhere down the street, a lawnmower hummed. Normal sounds of a normal day, even as something fundamental had shifted in their small world. I think, Danny said finally, I'd like to frame this. Put it with his other important papers. Mariah smiled through her tears. I think that's a wonderful idea. The afternoon sun streamed through Danny's living room window, casting long shadows across the scattered medical bills on his coffee table. His ribs still ached, but the pain had dulled to a manageable throb over the past 2 weeks. What hurt more was the official-looking envelope that had arrived that morning. He picked it up again, though he'd already memorized every word. Notice of default and intent to foreclose stared back at him in bold letters. 2 missed mortgage payments? He'd known they were coming due, but with the accident and time off work, there just wasn't enough money. The front door opened, and Danny hastily shoved the notice under a magazine. Mariah walked in carrying groceries, her face bright with her usual warm smile. "I found those wheat crackers you like," she called out, heading for the kitchen. "And Miss Edna sent over another casserole. That woman is determined to fatten you up." "Thanks," Danny managed, his voice tight. "You don't have to keep doing all this." Mariah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her smile faded. As she studied his face, "What's wrong?" "Nothing." He shifted uncomfortably on the couch, wincing at the movement. "Just tired." She crossed the room and sat in the armchair across from him. "Danny Cole, I've spent enough time with you these past weeks to know when something's bothering you. Out with it." Before he could respond, a gust of wind from the open window scattered the papers on the coffee table. The foreclosure notice slipped free from its hiding place, landing face up at Mariah's feet. She bent to pick it up before he could stop her. Her eyes widened as she read. "Danny," she began. "Don't." His voice was sharp. "Just don't. But I can help." "No." He pushed himself up straighter, ignoring the protest from his ribs. "I appreciate everything you've done, Mariah. The youth center, staying here to help while I recover. But this is my problem. It doesn't have to be," she said softly. "I have more money than I know what to do with. That's exactly why I can't take." Danny's jaw clenched. "I'm not a charity case. I'm not looking for handouts." "This isn't charity," Mariah protested. "This is family." "Family?" Danny gave a bitter laugh that made his chest hurt. "A month ago, we were strangers. You can't just walk in here and try to fix everything with money." Hurt flashed across Mariah's face. She set the notice down carefully and stood up. "I'll get started on dinner." Danny watched her disappear into the kitchen, guilt mixing with his anger and shame. He heard cabinet doors opening and closing with more force than necessary, the clatter of pots and pans expressing what she wouldn't say out loud. That night, after Mariah left, Danny sat alone in his darkened living room. The foreclosure notice seemed to mock him from the coffee table. He thought about Caleb, about the promises he'd made to give him a good life, a stable home. Now he couldn't even keep the roof over his own head. The next morning, Danny woke to find an envelope had been slipped under his front door. His name was written on it in Mariah's elegant handwriting. Inside was a letter and some documents from the bank. "Dear Danny, I know you'll be angry when you read this, but please finish the letter before you react. I've paid off your mortgage, not just the late payments, all of it. The house is yours, free and clear. Before you crumple this up, please understand, this isn't about guilt or charity. This is about love. Not just my love for Caleb, though that grows stronger every day as I learn more about him through you. This is about honoring the kind of love you showed him, pure, unconditional, asking nothing in return. You taught me what real family means. It's not about blood or birth certificates or social status. It's about choosing to love, choosing to give, choosing to be there. You chose Caleb, and in doing so, you showed me what I should have done all those years ago with David and Lena. I can't change the past. I can't give Caleb back his heritage when it might have mattered. But I can do this. I can make sure his father, his real father, the one who loved him every day, keeps the home where Caleb grew up, where he played and laughed and felt safe and loved. The money means nothing to me compared to that. I've made the payment in Caleb's name. Consider it his gift to you for all the love you gave him. You don't owe me anything. You don't even have to thank me. Just please accept this with the same love it's given with. All my love." Mariah Danny's hand shook as he read the bank documents. It was true. The mortgage was paid in full. His house, the home where he'd raised Caleb, where every room held memories of his son, was secure. Tears blurred his vision as he read the letter again. He thought about all the times he'd judged Mariah, assumed her gifts came from guilt or pity. But she was right. This felt different. This felt like love. He reached for his phone, then stopped. What could he possibly say? Thank you seemed inadequate for such an enormous gift. And yet, maybe that was the point. Real family love couldn't be measured or repaid. It just was. The morning light filtered through his windows, touching the familiar walls that had witnessed so much of his life with Caleb. He could almost hear the echo of his son's laughter, see the ghost of him running down the hallway, toy truck in hand. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. Not just because the weight of the mortgage was gone, but because it had become something more. A bridge between past and present, between two kinds of love that had shaped Caleb's life, whether he knew it or not. Danny carefully folded the letter and placed it in the box with Caleb's important papers, next to the amended birth certificate. Another piece of their shared history, another thread connecting their unlikely family. The afternoon sun filtered through Danny's living room window as he stared at the letter from the bank in disbelief. His hand shook as he read it again. His mortgage had been paid in full, every last penny. His first reaction was confusion, then realization, and finally, a surge of anger that made his still-healing ribs ache. "Mariah," he muttered, crumpling the paper in his fist. Without bothering to change out of his worn t-shirt and sweatpants, Danny grabbed his truck keys. The pain in his side protested as he climbed into the driver's seat, but he ignored it. He knew exactly where to find her Miss Edna's house. The two women had been taking turns checking on him since the accident. The drive was short, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Small-town streets rolled past in a blur of familiar storefronts and spring flowers. When he pulled up to Miss Edna's yellow Craftsman house, he spotted Mariah's silver sedan in the driveway. Danny marched up the porch steps, his footfalls heavy on the wooden boards. Before he could knock, Miss Edna opened the door, her wise eyes taking in his thunderous expression. "I suppose you got the bank letter," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. Mariah stood in Miss Edna's kitchen, her normally perfect posture tense as she gripped a coffee mug. She wore a simple blue blouse today, looking less like the polished society woman he'd first met at the cemetery. "How dare you?" Danny said, his voice low and tight. "You had no right." "Danny, please sit down before you hurt yourself," Miss Edna interrupted, pulling out a kitchen chair. He ignored her. "I don't need your charity, Mariah. I don't need you swooping in to fix everything with your money, like that somehow makes up for there's a letter." Mariah cut in softly, reaching into her purse. "Please read it before you say anything else." Danny stared at the cream-colored envelope she held out, his jaw clenched. After a long moment, he snatched it from her hand and tore it open. The handwriting was elegant, but shaky. "Dear Danny, this isn't charity, and it isn't guilt, though. God knows I carry enough of that. This is love. Love for a grandson I never knew, but who filled your heart and home with joy for 12 precious years. Love for the man who gave him everything. I was too proud and foolish to give my own son. I know money can't fix the past. It can't bring back Caleb or David. It can't erase the pain I caused Lena. But what it can do is ensure that the home where Caleb grew up, where he learned to walk and laugh and dream, stays in the hands of the only real father he ever knew. I found photos in David's things after he passed pictures of him and Lena that summer they met. They were so young, so in love. And in every image, they looked at each other the same way you looked at Caleb in all the pictures you've shown me, with pure, unconditional love. This isn't about control or obligation. This is about honoring the love that made you Caleb's father, regardless of blood. This is about making sure his childhood home remains a testament to that love. Please accept this gift not from me, but from Caleb. Let it be his way of taking care of you, just as you always took care of him." With deep gratitude and respect, Danny's hands trembled as he lowered the letter. He looked up to find Mariah watching him, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, he saw past her careful facade to the broken mother beneath a woman who'd lost both her son and grandson without ever truly knowing either of them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I can't buy forgiveness. She gestured helplessly. "I needed to do something good in his name. Something that would have made both David and Caleb proud." Danny sank into the kitchen chair, the fight draining out of him. Miss Edna quietly set a glass of sweet tea in front of him, her weathered hand squeezing his shoulder. "All those years," Danny said, his voice rough with emotion. "I worried I wasn't enough for him, that because I wasn't his real father." He trailed off, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Oh, Danny." Mariah moved closer, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor. "You were everything to him. Everything David and I failed to be. You would have loved him," Danny said softly. He had this laugh that could light up a whole room. And he was so kind, always bringing home stray animals, sharing his lunch with kids who forgot theirs. Mariah smiled through her tears. Like David, when he was young, before I taught him that status mattered more than kindness. She shook her head. I won't make that mistake again. Danny stood slowly, mindful of his healing ribs. He faced Mariah, really seeing her for the first time, not as the proud woman who'd hurt Lena, but as someone fighting to make amends the only way she knew how. Thank you, he said simply, pulling her into a careful hug, not for the money, but for loving him enough to do this. Mariah's shoulders shook as she returned his embrace. Thank you for being the father he was. Deserved. Miss Edna quietly wiped her eyes with her apron, watching the healing unfold in her sunny kitchen. Sometimes, she thought, love found its way home through the most unexpected paths. Danny released Mariah and picked up the letter again, running his thumb over the words. He would have forgiven you, you know. Caleb had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. Just like his father, Mariah said softly, and they both knew she meant Danny. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the youth center's parking lot as Danny rolled out the old tool cart he'd donated. 6 eager faces watched his every move, their eyes wide with curiosity. These after-school sessions had started small, but word spread quickly among the local kids. All right, guys, Danny said, pulling out a spark plug. Who remembers what this is from last time? Ooh, I know. A freckled boy named Tommy shot his hand up. It's a spark plug. It makes the engine go vroom. Danny couldn't help but smile. Close enough. Today we're going to learn how to check if they're working right. As he demonstrated the proper technique, Danny felt a familiar warmth in his chest. Caleb used to stand right where these kids were, pepper him with questions about engines and tools. His son had loved helping others figure things out, always patient with younger kids who needed extra help. Through the window, he spotted Mariah in the classroom next door, gesturing animatedly as she led her reading group. She'd brought in her collection of poetry books, determined to show the teens how words could change their world. The sight of her passionate teaching reminded him of what she'd told him about her years in the classroom. Mr. Cole? Tommy tugged at his sleeve. Can I try now? Sure thing, buddy. Danny handed him the spark plug tester, just like I showed you. The next hour flew by as the kids took turns practicing. Danny moved between them, adjusting grips and offering encouragement. When one boy struggled, getting frustrated, Danny knelt beside him. Hey, it's okay. Nobody gets it perfect the first time. He steadied the boy's hands. Caleb, my son, he dropped more tools than I could count when he was learning, but he never gave up. The boy's face brightened. Really? Really. And look at you now. You've almost got it. After class, Danny was cleaning up when Mr. Lawson, the youth center director, stopped by. These classes are making a real difference, Danny. The kids can't stop talking about them. Just trying to pass on what I know, Danny replied, wiping his hands on a rag. It's more than that. Mr. Lawson leaned against the workbench. You're giving them confidence, purpose. That's what Caleb would have wanted. Danny nodded, his throat tight. Through the door, he could hear Mariah's voice carrying from her classroom, reading a poem about hope and new beginnings. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Danny found himself walking with Mariah toward the cemetery. They each carried small gardening tools and a flat of bright marigolds, Caleb's favorite flowers. The girl who barely spoke last week, Mariah said as they walked. Today she read her own poem out loud, about her dreams of becoming a doctor. That's wonderful. Danny smiled, remembering how Caleb used to help younger kids with their homework. These kids just need someone to believe in them. They reached Caleb's grave just as the sky turned golden. Danny set down the flowers and began clearing away dead leaves while Mariah prepared the soil. They worked in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized after weeks of growing friendship. He would have loved the youth center, Danny said softly, placing the first marigold in the earth. Especially now, with all the kids learning and growing there. Mariah nodded, her hands gentle as she planted another flower. I see him in their faces sometimes. Their curiosity, their kindness. She paused, brushing soil from her fingers. I see him in you too, Danny, the way you teach them, encourage them. Danny's hands stilled in the dirt. You know, I used to worry that not being his biological father somehow made my love less real. But these past months, he looked at the flowers they were planting, bright spots of color against the grass. I've learned that love isn't about DNA, it's about choices. Everyday choices to care, to show up, to make things better. That's what makes you his father, Mariah said quietly. That's what makes this, she gestured to the youth center visible in the distance, his legacy. They finished planting the marigolds as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in pink and orange. Standing back, Danny looked at their work. The flowers formed a heart around Caleb's headstone, a splash of life and color in the quiet cemetery. Mariah reached over and squeezed his hand. No words were needed. They both understood that while grief would always be part of their lives, it didn't have to be the only part. Through the youth center, through these small acts of kindness and teaching, Caleb's spirit lived on. As they gathered their tools to leave, Danny took one last look at the grave. The marigolds seemed to glow in the fading light, a reminder that even in the darkest soil, new life could bloom. Together, he and Mariah had found a way to honor Caleb's memory, not just through tears, but through action, by helping others grow, learn, and believe in themselves, just as Caleb would have wanted. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Miss Edna's front porch as Danny sat in his usual rocking chair, a stack of papers balanced on his knee. Mariah perched on the worn wooden steps below, her reading glasses hanging from a delicate chain around her neck. "What about this wording?" Danny asked, holding up a draft of the scholarship announcement, in memory of Caleb Cole, whose kindness touched everyone he met. His voice caught slightly on store, his son's name. Even now, months later, speaking it aloud still brought a familiar ache to his chest. Mariah looked up, her eyes gentle. "It's perfect, Danny. Simple and true." Miss Edna emerged from her screen door, carrying a tray with 3 glasses of sweet tea. The ice clinked musically as she set it down on the small table between them. In her other hand, she clutched her ever-present knitting bag. "I've been thinking," she said, settling into her chair and pulling out familiar blue yarn. "Every winter should have something special to remember this by, something personal." Her knitting needles clicked together as she began a new row. Caleb always did love this shade of blue. Danny smiled, remembering how his son had insisted on painting his bedroom that exact color. He said it reminded him of the sky on perfect fishing days. Mariah reached for one of the tea glasses, her hand trembling slightly. The scholarship committee needs to be diverse, people who really understand what these kids are going through. She paused, taking a careful sip. "I was thinking we should include single parents, educators, maybe someone from the youth center?" Danny nodded, shuffling through his papers. "I talked to Principal Matthews yesterday. She's on board to help us set everything up through the school." He pulled out a rough draft of the application form. "We need to make sure this isn't too complicated. Some of these families barely have time to breathe, let alone fill out endless paperwork." Miss Edna's needles continued their steady rhythm as she worked. "You both know what it's like to lose someone you love," she said softly. "That understanding, it's going to mean so much to these children." The 3 sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. A gentle breeze carried the scent of Miss Edna's flowering jasmine, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. "I was thinking," Mariah said, pulling a notebook from her bag, "we could offer 3 scholarships to start. One for elementary, one for middle school, and one for high school." She looked up at Danny. The money could help with anything from school supplies to tutoring, maybe even summer programs. Danny leaned forward, running a hand through his graying hair. "We should make it clear that it's not just about grades, Caleb." He smiled at the memory. He wasn't always top of his class, but he never met someone he wouldn't help. "Character over credentials," Miss Edna agreed, her needles clicking faster. "That's what matters most." Mariah began writing, her pen moving quickly across the page. "We'll need recommendation letters, but not just from teachers. Maybe from neighbors, coaches, anyone who knows the child well. And we should have the kids write something themselves," Danny added. "Nothing fancy, just their hopes, their dreams, what they do with the opportunity." Miss Edna held up her knitting, examining the pattern forming beneath her. Skilled hands. The scarf was already taking shape, a delicate cable design running through the center like a winding river. "Each scarf will be unique," she said, "just like each child who receives one." Danny stood up and paced the porch, his steps creaking against the old boards. "We need to make sure the whole process is fair. Maybe we should review the applications without names first?" Mariah nodded approvingly, blind judging. "That's smart, Danny." She made another note. "And we should have a mix of people on the selection committee who don't know each other, to keep everything impartial. The youth center director would be perfect. Miss Edna suggested, her needles never stopping. She sees these kids when they're just being themselves, not trying to impress anyone. They work through the afternoon, refining details and sharing ideas. The scholarship began to take shape, not just as a program, but as a living tribute to Caleb's memory. Danny felt something shift inside him, as they planned a weight he'd carried for so long beginning to lift. Mariah must have noticed the change in his expression. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Danny looked out over the familiar neighborhood, where children were playing in the golden light of early evening. "I'm thinking about how proud Caleb would be, how this is exactly the kind of thing he'd want us to do." Miss Edna set down her knitting and reached for his hand. "He would be proud, Danny, of both of you." Mariah stood up, brushing off her skirt. "I'll type up everything we've discussed and email it to Principal Matthews tonight. We can start spreading the word next week." "I'll have the first scarf ready by then," Miss Edna said, holding up her work to show the progress. The blue yarn caught the light, reminding Danny of summer skies and fishing trips and his son's bright eyes. They gathered their papers and empty glasses as the sun began to set. The scholarship was more than just a program now. It was a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope. As Danny watched Mariah walk to her car and Miss Edna return to her knitting, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The quiet satisfaction of doing something truly meaningful. The Caleb Cole Memorial Scholarship would ensure that his son's spirit of kindness and generosity would live on, touching lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. And somehow, in creating this legacy for Caleb, both Danny and Mariah had found another piece of their own healing. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers arranged folding chairs and draped white tablecloths over long tables. Paper lanterns in Caleb's favorite shade of blue hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow across the room. Danny adjusted his tie, the same one he'd worn to Caleb's graduation, and watched people filter in through the double doors. Miss Edna supervised a group of teenagers setting out place cards. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore a brooch that Caleb had given her for Christmas years ago. She caught Danny's eye and gave him an encouraging smile. "The turnout is wonderful," Mariah said, appearing at his side. She wore a simple navy dress, her usual polish softened by grandmother-like warmth. In her hands, she clutched note cards for her speech. Danny nodded, his throat tight. "I didn't expect so many people." The room filled quickly with familiar faces, mechanics from his shop, teachers from Caleb's school, parents from the youth center, and dozens of townspeople who'd known his son. Even Mr. Lawson from the youth center had traded his usual casual attire for a suit jacket. "Everyone loved Caleb," Mariah said softly, "and they love you too, Danny." The catering staff, donated by the local diner, began serving plates of chicken marsala. The gentle clink of silverware and murmur of conversation filled the air. Danny's hands were sweaty as he gripped the edge of his chair at the head table. Mr. Lawson stepped up to the microphone. "Welcome, everyone. We're here tonight to establish something special, the Caleb Cole Memorial Scholarship. But before we get to the details, we have two people who'd like to share their hearts with you." Mariah rose gracefully, smoothing her dress. She walked to the podium, her note cards steady in her hands. The room fell silent. "Many of you don't know me," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I'm Mariah Bennett, and I came to this town as a stranger, carrying the weight of past mistakes. You see, Caleb Cole was my grandson, though I never had the privilege of knowing him." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I learned about him too late, after both he and my son had passed away. My pride and prejudice years ago cost me the chance to know this remarkable young man. But through Danny's grace and forgiveness, I've been given the gift of knowing Caleb through the lives he touched." Tears glistened in her eyes, but her about Bast voice remained steady. "Loss changes us. It can make us bitter, or it can teach us to love more deeply. Forgiveness isn't easy. I know that better than most. But watching this community embrace Caleb's memory, seeing how his spirit lives on in every child who walks through the youth center doors, it's taught me that it's never too late to choose love over fear, acceptance over judgment." Danny watched as several people wiped their eyes. Miss Edna reached over and squeezed his hand. "This scholarship," Mariah continued, "isn't just about helping children afford college. It's about honoring a young man who saw the best in everyone. It's about telling single parents that they're not alone. Most of all, it's about turning loss into legacy." She stepped back from the podium to warm applause. Danny stood, his legs shaky, and took her place. He pulled out his worn wallet and removed a folded photograph. "This is the last picture taken of me and Caleb," he said, holding it up. "We were fishing at Miller's Lake. He'd just graduated high school, and I remember being so proud I could hardly speak. What you can't see in this photo is that I'm not his biological father." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Danny took a deep breath. "I met Caleb's mother when he was just a baby. The moment I held him, I knew I wanted to be his dad. Not because of DNA or obligation, but because love doesn't care about bloodlines. Every scraped knee I bandaged, every homework assignment I helped with, every ball game I cheered at, those moments made me a father." His voice cracked slightly. "Being a single parent means doubting yourself sometimes. It means working double shifts and still feeling like you're not doing enough. But it also means discovering strength you never knew you had. Caleb taught me that family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who you choose to love." Miss Edna dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Several other people did the same. "This scholarship," Danny continued, "is for every parent who's doing it alone. It's for every kid who needs to know their dreams matter. And it's for my son, who showed me that the best kind of love is the kind that grows bigger than ourselves." When he finished, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. Mr. Lawson returned to the microphone to explain the scholarship details, but Danny barely heard him. He was lost in memories of Caleb's smile, his laugh, the way he'd hugged Danny extra tight after they'd been apart. Later, as the evening wound down, Mr. Lawson approached with tears in his eyes. "We've counted the donations," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "including the matching funds from local businesses. We've got enough to fully fund the scholarship for 3 years." Mariah gasped softly. Danny stared at the figure on the paper Mr. Lawson handed him. This is more than we hoped for," he managed. "That's what happens when a community comes together," Miss Edna said, joining them. She held up one of her hand-knitted blue scarves. "And I've got plenty more where these came from." Danny looked around the room at the lingering guests, his neighbors, his friends, his chosen family. Some were helping stack chairs. Others were boxing up leftover food to donate to the local shelter. Each person had come tonight carrying a piece of Caleb's memory, and together they'd built something beautiful from their collective love. Mariah touched his arm gently. "He would be so proud, Danny, not just of this, but of you." Danny nodded, unable to speak. Through the community center windows, he could see the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, he liked to think, Caleb was smiling down on all of them. Spring sunshine streamed through the community center's windows, warming the polished wooden floors. Fresh flowers, daisies and blue hydrangeas, decorated every table, their sweet scent mixing with the lingering aroma of coffee and Miss Edna's famous peach cobbler. Paper programs rustled as people settled into their seats, the room packed with familiar faces from around town. Danny stood at the side of the stage, his hands deep in his pockets to hide their trembling. He wore his good suit, the one he'd had cleaned specially for today, and a blue tie that matched the ribbon on the scholarship certificate. From across the room, Miss Edna gave him an encouraging nod as she adjusted the special blue scarf she'd knitted for today's recipient. Principal Matthews stepped up to the microphone, tapping it gently. "Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this historic moment, the presentation of the first annual Caleb Cole Memorial Scholarship." She paused as warm applause filled the room. "Before we announce our recipient, I'd like to share something about the young man this scholarship honors." Danny's chest tightened as a photograph of Caleb appeared on the screen behind the podium. His son at 16, grinning broadly, arms wrapped around 2 younger kids at the youth center. The image brought back memories of that day. Caleb had spent hours teaching those kids to build model cars, his patience never wearing thin. Caleb Cole embodied the spirit of this community, Principal Matthews continued. He tutored younger students, volunteered at our youth center, and showed us all what it means to lift others up. This scholarship, created in his memory, will help another young person follow in his footsteps. Mariah sat in the front row, her eyes glistening. She wore a pale blue dress and the pearl necklace Danny had noticed she always wore when something important was happening. Their eyes met briefly, and she smiled, that warm grandmother smile that had become so familiar over the past months. The selection committee reviewed dozens of applications. Principal Matthews said, her voice carrying clear across the hushed room. "We look for students who not only showed academic, promise, but also demonstrated Caleb's spirit of kindness and community service. Today, we're honored to present this award to a remarkable young lady who embodies these qualities. Danny's heart pounded as he watched Principal Matthews open the envelope. The paper caught the sunlight, making the gold seal gleam. The first recipient of the Caleb Cole Memorial Scholarship is Sarah Martinez, 7th grade. The room erupted in applause as a small figure rose from the middle rows. Sarah Martinez was 13, with dark braids and wearing a carefully pressed yellow dress. Her grandfather, Mr. Martinez, who Danny recognized from his auto shop, helped her stand, his weathered face beaming with pride. As Sarah made her way to the stage, Danny noticed she walked with the same quiet determination he'd seen in Caleb. He'd heard about her, how she helped care for her younger siblings while maintaining honor roll grades, how she started a reading club for elementary school kids at the library. Danny stepped forward, holding the framed certificate. His hands had steadied now, and warmth spread through his chest as Sarah approached. Her eyes were bright with tears and joy as she climbed the 3 steps to the stage. "Congratulations, Sarah," Danny said, his voice rough with emotion. He handed her the certificate, then watched as Miss Edna draped the hand-knitted blue scarf around the girl's shoulders. The wool caught the light, showing the intricate pattern Miss Edna had worked into it. Small interlocking hearts, just like the ones she'd knitted into Caleb's winter scarves. Sarah looked up at Danny, her smile trembling slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," she whispered. "I promise I'll make you proud." Without hesitation, Danny opened his arms, and Sarah stepped into them. The embrace was gentle, natural, like hugging his own child. The audience's applause swelled, filling the room with joy and hope. Through the noise, Danny heard Mariah's soft voice beside him. Caleb would have been proud. Her words carried no trace of the old pain or guilt, just pure love and certainty. Sarah's grandfather had made his way to the stage, tears streaming freely down his lined face. He shook Danny's hand with both of his, speaking rapidly in Spanish and English, his gratitude overflowing. Danny recognized in the older man's eyes the same fierce love he'd felt for Caleb, the love of a guardian who'd stepped up to raise a child, not born to them, but chosen by heart. The applause continued as Sarah posed for pictures, first with Danny and Mariah, then with her grandfather and Principal Matthews. The blue scarf around her shoulders caught the spring sunlight, making the intricate pattern shimmer. She held her certificate carefully, reverently, as if it were made of glass instead of paper. Looking out at the gathered crowd, at Miss Edna, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, at Mr. Lawson from the youth center grinning broadly, at all the faces that had become family in ways he never expected, Danny felt something settle in his heart. It wasn't the absence of grief, but rather its transformation into something new and hopeful, like spring flowers pushing through winter soil. Sarah returned to her seat, the blue scarf trailing behind her like a banner of promise. Her grandfather wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pressing a kiss to her forehead. In that gesture, Danny saw echoes of countless moments with Caleb. Homework help at the kitchen table, quiet fishing trips, proud smiles at school events. Love that transcended biology, chosen and given freely. The late afternoon sun hung low over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. Danny's truck kicked up small clouds of dust as he parked in the familiar spot near the water's edge. The fishing pier, where he and Caleb had spent countless summer afternoons, stretched out before them, its weathered boards still holding countless memories. Mariah stepped out of the passenger side, holding a small white candle and matches in her hands. Her gray hair caught the evening light, making it look almost silver. She wore a simple blue cardigan, Caleb's favorite color, over her dress. Danny reached into the truck's back seat and carefully lifted out Caleb's old toy truck. The red paint was chipped in places, and one of the wheels still squeaked just like it always had. He held it for a moment, running his thumb over the scratches and dents that told the story of a well-loved toy. This was his favorite, Danny said softly, showing it to Mariah. He carried it everywhere until he was 7, even slept with it under his pillow. Mariah touched the toy gently, her eyes glistening. "It looks just like the one David had when he was little. He used to make the most wonderful vrooming sounds while playing with it." They walked together down to the pier, their footsteps echoing hollow against the wooden planks. The water lapped quietly below them, peaceful and constant. A few ducks paddled nearby, leaving gentle ripples in their wake. Danny sat down at the edge, his feet dangling over the water. Mariah settled beside him, smoothing her dress carefully. She placed the unlit candle between them. "I brought something too," Danny said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out Lena's letter, the paper soft and worn from being read so many times. The evening breeze tried to catch its corners, but he held it steady. "Would you like to hear it?" he asked, glancing at Mariah. She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "Very much." Danny cleared his throat and unfolded the letter carefully. The setting sun made the words glow orange on the page. "My dearest Danny, if you're reading this, then you know the truth about Caleb's father. I've carried this secret for so long, not out of shame or doubt, but because the truth seemed less important than the love you gave so freely. You never once questioned whether Caleb was yours. You loved him completely from the moment you met me, when I was 7 months pregnant and scared. You became his father not through blood, but through every bedtime story, every scraped knee, every proud moment at his baseball games. David Bennett was a chapter in my life that closed long ago. His mother made sure of that. Though I don't blame her anymore. She was protecting her son the only way she knew how. Just as I protected Caleb by giving him a father who chose him. I hope someday you can forgive me for not telling you sooner. And I hope you can forgive yourself for any doubt this might bring. You were always enough, Danny, more than enough. You were everything a father should be. Tell our son's story proudly. Let his memory be a light that brings people together, not a shadow that keeps them apart. With all my love, Lena." Danny's voice cracked on the last words. He folded the letter carefully, holding it close to his chest for a moment before tucking it back into his pocket. Mariah wiped tears from her cheeks with trembling fingers. "She was right about you," she said softly. "Everything a father should be." The sun was barely visible now, a sliver of bright orange touching the horizon. Mariah struck a match, its small flame dancing in the growing twilight. She lit the candle and carefully placed it in a small paper boat she'd brought. Danny set Caleb's toy truck between them, its red paint glowing in the candlelight. Together, they lowered the floating light to the water's surface. The tiny flame bobbed gently as small waves carried it away from the pier. "I wish I'd known him," Mariah whispered, watching the candle drift. "But in a way, I feel like I do now, through you, through these moments we share." Danny nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was steady and sure. He would have liked you, especially your poetry classes at the youth center. He always had a way with words. The candle floated farther out, its light reflecting off the dark water like a star fallen to earth. Cricket songs filled the evening air, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Mariah's hand found Danny's in the growing darkness. Her grip was warm and firm, offering comfort without words. He squeezed back, surprising himself with how natural it felt. This connection forged through shared loss and growing understanding. They sat in comfortable silence until the candle was just a distant point of light. Danny picked up the toy truck, holding it one last time before placing it carefully in his jacket pocket. When they finally stood to leave, the first stars were appearing overhead. The walk back to the truck was slow and peaceful. Their footsteps fell into an easy rhythm, no longer strangers trying to navigate around each other, but family finding their way together. The gravel crunched beneath their feet, mixing with the evening sounds of frogs and crickets. At the truck, Danny held the door open for Mariah. Before getting in, she paused and looked back at the lake, now silvered by starlight and memory. "Thank you," she said simply, "for sharing him with me." Danny looked out over the water where their candle had floated, carrying their love and grief into the gathering night. The light was gone now, but something else remained, something stronger than loss, more lasting than pain. It was the bridge their son had built between them, turning strangers into family, turning grief into grace. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Danny Cole, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.